This probably won't come as a surprise to you, but in medical school, you're going to be doing a lot of studying. But it's a balancing act. If you understudy, you're not going to learn the information, sure. But if you overstudy, you can be tired, no motivation. It can actually work against you, and it can be more difficult to learn or to think. And you're going to have less time in your life for other things, like taking care of yourself, hobbies, family, and friends. So while repetition is really important, what's the right way to go about it? What's the best way to go about it? And the answer is spaced repetition. So let's look at these two possibilities. If you have 12 hours to study, do you spend 12 hours in one session or 3 hours each over 4 sessions? The first one is called massed repetition. The second one is spaced repetition. Spaced repetition and repetition in general relies on the fact that neurons that fire together wire together. The more you activate and engage and fire those neurons, the more that information is going to be accessible in your long-term memory, whether it is to answer a test question or to work with patients. This is the forgetting curve and actually shows how spaced repetition can help. Let's say, well, you're not going to learn 100% from lecture probably, but let's say that after you leave lecture, you're at 100% of what you learned that day. As time goes on, as soon as you leave lecture, you're going to be rapidly forgetting it. The more that you knew beforehand, you'll probably forget a little bit less, especially if you've seen this before. But if this is your first time learning the information, it's going to leave pretty quickly. Now, where spaced repetition comes in is, of course, you're going to review the material, but spaced repetition tells you a little bit more how. We can see here in the graph that after, don't get caught up in the numbers, but let's say that they forgot a lot after a day. They forgot about 80% or about 20% of the material, and it's rapidly decreasing to how much that they remember. If you review after that day, you can bump yourself up to 100%. You're back now where you were when you left class because you reviewed that material. What happens now? You can see on the graph that the decay, how quickly the information is forgotten, is now at a slower rate. And again, don't get caught up in the exact numbers or the slopes, but the principle is the same, that each time you review, you're going to remember it for longer, and you're going to remember more. So over time, you do want to keep reviewing, but you can space it out longer and longer. You don't want to keep reviewing the material every single day. Number one, that's not going to be possible because as you keep learning new things, now you need to be reviewing those as well. So if you're reviewing everything that you've learned in medical school every day, eventually, and actually pretty quickly, you're going to run out of time in the day. So after you first learn something, you review it quickly. As you get familiar with it, you can space it out longer and longer. One thing I recommend, and it's basic, you don't have to follow this exactly, but if you learn something, make sure to review it maybe later that day or the next day, and then do it a few days later, and then another week or two, and then from then on you might be able to space out months. Now, yeah, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like a lot of studying. Well, yeah, but you're going to be studying a lot regardless. You're going to be studying a lot. It's just a matter of whether it's going to be effective or not. With spaced repetition, you are reviewing more frequently at first, but as you learn it, you're going to be spacing it out so you're reviewing it less, and that's going to end up saving you time in the long run. One of the other options is if you don't review it enough at first, that each time you go back to it, you might have to relearn it over and over again and spend a lot more time than if you were spacing it out closer. One example is if students are cramming. If you cram for a test, if you've done that before, you probably noticed that you didn't really remember it after. It probably didn't get into your brain too well. That works if it's just one class and then you're done with it. But when you have to use this information over and over again, and when you're going to be tested on it in capstone, and in boards and in clinic, then you want this information there in your long-term memory. Here's an article from the American Psychological Association talking about spaced repetition, why it works. Researchers aren't exactly sure why spacing is so effective. However, one possible cause is that over time, people forget what they learned in their initial study session. Then, when they come back to the material later, the new study session jogs their memory and they recall what they learned the first time around. That process, forgetting and retrieval, helps cement the new knowledge in place. And this highlights something that I've noticed in other elements of learning, that when you make things more challenging on the brain, that can actually help you learn it. So studying and reviewing something when you've already forgotten some, that's a challenge to the brain, and it's going to help learning be more effective. Now, the caveat I would say is that you don't want to wait too long. You don't want to wait until it's completely forgotten, where you're looking at this and thinking, I don't even remember learning about this to begin with. What are these words? What is this? That takes longer to review. So I think there's a sweet spot where you've forgotten some, but you still have some context, some memory, and some information to pull from and to learn that other material that you've forgotten. So I think it's really useful to review while you're forgetting, but not when you've completely forgotten. It's somewhere in the middle. You don't want to study something that you already know, because then you're wasting time if you already know it perfectly. And if you've completely forgotten it, you might have to start from square one, which is going to take more study time. Maybe it might be a little more effective if you have that time, but unfortunately in medical school, one of the challenges is time. And I don't think that it's best to wait until you've completely forgot something. So review as you're forgetting, not when you've forgotten, and that the spacing between review sessions, if you're doing it the right way, will get longer and longer between them. So here's some tips. Review information you just learned more frequently. If it's new to you, revisit it often. Also, review what you forget or get wrong more frequently than what you remember and get right. So if it's new, or if it's something that isn't in your long-term memory yet, then review it more frequently. Things that you do know, review less frequently. As you're forgetting less and less between sessions, you can time the sessions out so you don't have to study them as frequently. That's going to save you time. As I said before, review when you're forgetting, not when it's completely forgotten. And frequency is more important than duration. Yes, you do need to spend some amount of time studying. It doesn't mean that duration doesn't matter at all. But if it's between the two, a longer study session may not be as beneficial to you as breaking that study session into two separate ones over multiple days, or at least breaking it up in some way. It's like going to the gym. Hopefully you don't expect that one long session at the gym is going to get you in your ideal shape. I'm sure you know that it takes consistency and frequency. You have to go more than once. Same thing with learning. If one really long gym session isn't going to get you more strong or more fit compared to doing sessions periodically and frequently over time, then the brain, which is sort of a muscle in a way that it adapts to challenges, it's not going to work for the brain either. So don't just do one long study session where you hunker down and, okay, we're going to study anatomy this entire day. Switch things up. Do a little anatomy today, do a little anatomy tomorrow or later on today, but break things up. Don't do it all at once. And I also recommend for for spaced repetition, active recall is a great technique to use with it. Active recall it's an active process, like it sounds, and it's where you are going to pull the information out of your brain rather than reading it or watching a video about it or highlighting text about it. Those are more passive because you are observing the information. You might be working with it, but what I really like about active recall is that you can't pull it out of your brain unless it's accessible. So active recall will show you what you have access to in your memory and what you haven't formed connections to yet. So it's a good way to self-test yourself before you go on the test and get a grade, which is going to tell you whether you did well or not. Might as well test yourself before the grade to see if you know the material. Here's some active recall strategies. It's really simple. You're just going to make things, or you're going to talk about things, but you're pulling it out of your brain. One example is to spend 3 minutes after class writing down everything you remember without looking at your notes. Class ends, write everything down you remember, then you look at your notes to see how well you did. What did you remember? What did you forget? If you forgot it, that may be the first thing that you study. You can draw a biochemical pathway from memory or a physio pathway from memory. You can draw a one-sheet or mind map you made from memory. Or talk it out. Explain the material to a friend, a family member, a pet, or to yourself or an imaginary person. It doesn't have to be someone there. You can be talking it out in the car, on your way to school or wherever. But all these have in common that you are using the information unprompted. Be flexible. It doesn't have to be any one of those examples. It can be whatever you want. There's 3 basic steps to active recall. You recall the information without your notes, then you check the notes and make corrections or additions when necessary, and then you repeat again, following those principles of spaced repetition. It's simple, and it can and should be very quick. If you already have, let's say, a one-sheet drawn with your notes, the high-yield notes, if you already have that there, then it should only take a couple minutes to draw it out shorthand. Just write down the information. It can be shorthand. You're not using this as a study guide. You're testing yourself. It should only take a few minutes to do that, and it can be immensely effective. You do those 3 minutes, you check. Let's say you got 90% of it correct. Okay, move on to the next thing. Let's say you only got 20%. Well, you still might move on, but you're going to want to revisit that material a lot sooner. Another thing you could do is if you check and you see that you only got 20% correct, well, maybe you need to study that right now. Spend some time on it, and then move on. So it's a really good way to see where you're at. So how can you do active recall? You can schedule it out. This lecture, cardiac cycle, is on this day, so I'm going to study it for a bit the next day, and then a couple days later, and then the week after. You can schedule it out. That's not what I did, but you can if that's what you like. You can use a program like Anki. We'll talk about that next, but it's a program that has spaced repetition built in, so you don't have to think about it. Or you can do it organically. Just repeat things when you need to. If you haven't reviewed it in a while, do some active recall. See how much you know. If you know a lot, good, move on. If you don't know a lot, review it. Another recommendation is this is really useful when you're learning another layer of something. So for example, you're going to start with basic sciences and then you're going to learn pathology. Basic sciences gives you the foundation of how things are supposed to work, and then pathology teaches you what goes wrong when they don't work. When I got to pathology, the first thing I would do before I let myself study pathology was I had to go back to the basic sciences and make sure I knew that first. Because I had the sense that if I don't know the basic function, how am I going to understand the dysfunction? In that way, I was doing spaced repetition for first year material. I do the first board review, or a review for the first boards, and I can't tell you how many students have told me I haven't looked at this material in years. That's not good. That's not going to put you in a good position when you're studying for boards. You'd rather be more familiar than thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much I need to learn that I haven't seen. So it can be scheduled, it can be with the assistance of a program, but you can also just do it naturally based on what you're learning, based on quizzing yourself, and based on self-reflection. Anki is a Japanese word for memorization. This program, it's a free program, Anki Web. They have decks already built, like flashcard decks, so you don't have to make them yourself. You can, but you can use others. And what they do is you'll just choose a deck, and like flashcards, they'll show you a card, and then you answer it. If you get it right, it goes into the correct pile. If you get it wrong, it goes into the incorrect pile. The incorrect pile, they're going to show it to you much sooner than the correct pile. So if you get it wrong, you're going to see it maybe later that day. If you get it right, you might not see it for a couple of days. So they already have that spaced repetition built in. If you're making index cards, I don't necessarily recommend that because it can be really time consuming. But if you are making it, you can do this yourself. Just test, and then, okay, if it's incorrect, incorrect pile. If it's correct, correct pile. And then the incorrect pile, you're going to review those first before you get to the correct pile. But you also don't need to use index cards or piles. Just make notes. I remembered this concept well. I didn't remember this concept, so I need to focus on that. And repetition doesn't mean repeat it exactly the same each time. It's actually good to switch it up. You can do a 3-minute active recall session one time. You can make a one-sheet session the next time. Or maybe you make the one sheet first, and then a couple days later, you do take 3 minutes to try to draw it back out or talk it all out. And then after that, you can go to a group study session and learn it in a different way. So keep switching it up. That's called variable practice. If you do the same thing over and over again, you're only going to be prepared for that. But when you challenge yourself to use the information in different ways, you're going to be more resilient and adaptable to how you use the information, and it's just going to be in your brain better. So don't stick to just one strategy. You might have a system, and maybe you find a few strategies that work really well in concert, but make sure you are using multiple different strategies rather than just one. For example, don't just use flashcards or Anki. You can use that as one strategy in the mixture. In conclusion, neurons that fire together wire together. So you want to keep firing them together, and that's where the repetition comes in. You keep repeating it. Eventually, those neurons are going to be linked pretty strongly, and you won't have to think hard to get to the information. Eventually, it becomes second nature. Spaced repetition is better than massed repetition. Don't study all of anatomy in an 8-hour block. Study it in 2-hour blocks each day rather than one 8-hour block at one time. It's better to break things up, and that's whether it's a class or a concept or even a particular strategy you're using. Switch it up. It's a little challenging for the brain to switch things. It is challenging, but that's part of the benefit. We learn better when we're challenged. You can schedule your repetition using an app or program, or just review the material periodically as needed. Do it the way that it makes sense to you, see how it works, and adapt when necessary. I found it very helpful. This is a recommendation from me to you as students starting your first year to remember when you get into pathology. I really recommend going back to basic science first before progressing into pathology. You'll get some spaced repetition. You'll review the basic sciences, which is going to be important for boards, and it's going to help you understand pathology better. And keep switching it up. Don't do the same thing. It's just like at the gym. If you do the same workout over and over again, eventually it's not going to work anymore. So like the gym, switch it up, do different things, and also like the gym, again, you're not going to get your goals in just one session. You're going to get it from going from consistency and repetition. So that's spaced repetition. It's how to use repetition to your benefit without overstudying. And so spaced repetition, what it's really good for is helping with recall and to learn the information and focusing on the information that you need to learn the most, while allowing yourself to not overstudy things that you already know. So try out spaced repetition, whether it's just periodically studying things and making sure that you're going back frequently and you're reflecting on, what haven't I reviewed in a while? Should I review something new? Or whether you're going to schedule it out and use a program. Use spaced repetition and ask us if you have any questions about it. how to do it best or what we recommend. But at the end of the day, you just got to try it and see how it works for you, and make whatever changes are necessary as they come up.